Sometimes life strips you down to nothing, leaving you standing alone with just hope to hold on to. Rosalind Blackwood found herself at 38, divorced, pregnant, and staring at the crumbling Victorian mansion she'd just inherited. The whole town of Cedar Falls whispered about her return, judging her condition and calling her foolish for trying to restore the old eyesore on Maple Street. The ivy-covered house had sat empty for 15 years, its weathered siding and sagging porch telling stories of abandonment. But beneath those rotting floorboards lay something that would silence every whisper. Her grandmother had left her more than just a broken-down house. She'd left her a $9 million secret that would change everything. Would Rosalind uncover the truth that could restore her future? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rusted key turned reluctantly in the front door's lock, as if the house itself was hesitant to welcome her home. Rosalind pushed against the warped wooden door, her 8-month belly making the simple act awkward and strained. The hinges groaned in protest, a sound that seemed to echo through the entire neighborhood, announcing to anyone within earshot that the Blackwood place was occupied again for the first time in 15 years. Inside, dust motes danced in the late afternoon, sunlight that filtered through grimy windows. The air hung thick with the scent of neglect, musty wallpaper, old wood, and something else she couldn't quite identify. Her footsteps echoed hollowly on the hardwood floors as she made her way through rooms that had once been filled with her grandmother's warmth and laughter. The living room still held traces of Grandmother Cordelia's presence. There by the bay window sat the ornate mahogany rocking chair that had been her grandmother's favorite spot for reading and watching the world go by. Its rich wood grain caught what light managed to penetrate the dirty glass, and for a moment, Rosalind could almost see the elderly woman sitting there, knitting needles, clicking rhythmically as she worked on another afghan for someone in need. "Lord have mercy, child. What are you doing here?" Rosalind turned to find Mrs. Penfield standing in the doorway, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the humidity, her disapproving expression as sharp as her Sunday pearls. The neighbor had let herself in through the unlocked front door, with the confidence of someone who'd been keeping an unofficial eye on the property for years. "Hello, Mrs. Penfield." Rosalind placed a protective hand over her belly. "I'm moving back in. The house is mine now." "Moving back?" The older woman's eyes widened as they took in Rosalind's condition. "Child, you can't possibly be thinking of raising a baby in this place. Half the floorboards are rotted through, and I swear I've seen raccoons coming and going through that broken cellar window." Rosalind had driven straight through from Atlanta, her packed car testament to just how few possessions remained after the divorce. Richard had kept the house, the furniture, even the wedding china her own mother had given them. All she'd managed to salvage were clothes, books, and a small savings account that wouldn't last 3 months. When the lawyer's letter arrived about Grandmother Cordelia's will, it had felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. "I don't have anywhere else to go," Rosalind said simply, and the truth of it hung in the dusty air between them. Mrs. Penfield's expression softened marginally. She'd known Rosalind since childhood, had watched her grow up during those magical summers spent at Cordelia's house. "What about your husband?" "Surely ex-husband," Rosalind corrected. "And he made it very clear that this baby and I are not his problem anymore." The silence stretched uncomfortably until a knock at the front door saved them both. A tall, weathered man in paint-stained coveralls stood on the sagging porch, toolbox in hand. "Ma'am, I'm Jacob Porter," Mrs. Penfield called, "and said you might. Need some help getting the utilities turned back on?" Jacob had kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of honest work. He was probably in his mid-40s, with graying temples and the sort of steady presence that made you feel safer just by being near him. Mrs. Penfield had clearly called him the moment she'd seen Rosalind's car in the driveway. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure I can afford—" "No charge," Jacob interrupted gently. "Your grandmother was good to my family when times were hard. Least I can do is make sure you have lights and running water before that baby decides to make an appearance." As Jacob worked to restore power to the old house, Rosalind found herself drawn back to her grandmother's rocking chair. The leather seat was worn smooth by decades of use, and when she sat down carefully, it seemed to cradle her aching back with familiar comfort. From this vantage point, she could see out onto Maple Street, where neighbors were beginning to notice the activity. At the Blackwood house, she could practically feel their stares, their whispered conversations across fence lines. Poor thing, back home pregnant and alone, always knew that city life would catch up with her. Cordelia would be rolling in her grave to see her granddaughter in such a state. The truth was more complicated, as truth often is. Her marriage to Richard had been dying a slow death for years, suffocated by his gambling addiction and her own desperate attempts to hold everything together. The pregnancy had been unplanned but not unwanted, at least not by her. Richard's reaction had been swift and brutal, an ultimatum that forced her to choose between her husband and her unborn child. She'd chosen the baby. "Power's back on," Jacob announced, wiping his hands on a rag. "Water's running too, though you'll want to let it run clear before drinking it. I've got some cleaning supplies in the truck if you'd like. This place could use a good scrubbing." "Why are you being so kind to me?" Rosalind asked. "You don't even know me." Jacob was quiet for a moment, his eyes taking in the faded family photographs still hanging crooked on the walls. "Your grandmother helped my sister's family when her husband lost his job at the mill. Brought groceries every week for 2 months, never made it feel like charity. Said family takes care of family. And in a small town, we're all family, whether we admit it or not." That night, after Mrs. Penfield had brought over a casserole and Jacob had replaced the broken cellar window, Rosalind sat alone in the rocking chair as darkness settled over Cedar Falls. The house creaked and settled around, her old bones adjusting to having someone home again. Somewhere in the walls, she could hear the scurrying of small creatures that had made themselves comfortable during the years of vacancy. But there were other sounds too, softer ones that seemed to whisper of memories. The gentle tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway that somehow still kept perfect time. The way the wind moved through the eaves, creating a sound like distant conversation. For just a moment, in the space between sleep and waking, she could swear she heard her grandmother's voice, humming an old hymn. The baby kicked strongly against her ribs, as if responding to some sound she couldn't hear. Rosalind placed both hands over her belly and felt a peace settle over her that she hadn't experienced in months. Maybe Mrs. Penfield was right about the practical challenges ahead. Maybe the townspeople were right about her foolishness in trying to restore this crumbling monument to better times. But sitting in that rocking chair, surrounded by the ghosts of love and laughter, Rosalind felt something she'd almost forgotten. She felt like she belonged somewhere. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new whispers, new reasons to doubt her decision. Tonight, though, she was home. The floorboard gave way under Rosalind's weight with a sharp crack that sent her heart racing. She'd been trying to move the heavy oak dresser in what had been her grandmother's bedroom when the rotted wood finally surrendered to time and moisture. Her 8-month belly made quick movement impossible, so she lowered herself carefully to examine the damage. What she found wasn't just broken wood, wedged between the floor joists, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected it from decades of dampness, was a leather-bound journal. The cover was deep burgundy, worn smooth by handling, with brass corners that had tarnished to a greenish patina. When she opened it, the pages released the faint scent of lavender, her grandmother's signature fragrance. The first entry was dated June 15th, 1963, written in Cordelia's careful script. Another family came through today, the Washingtons, with 3 little ones and fear in their eyes. Fed them, gave them clean clothes, and sent them north with what money I could spare from the fund, praying they make it safely to Chicago, where her sister waits. The movement grows stronger, but so does the resistance. Must be more careful about the records. Rosalind sank into the rocking chair, journal in her lap as the implications washed over her. Her prim, proper grandmother had been running some sort of underground railroad operation right here in Cedar Falls. Page after page revealed a network of safe houses, coded messages, and most intriguingly, references to the trust and protection of funds. July 3rd, 1963, collected another $200 from the Patterson family for the trust. Their boy starts college in the fall thanks to the scholarships we're funding. Mrs. Morrison contributed her late husband's tools, good for setting up families. Once they reach their destinations, the account at First National now holds $18,000. Pray it's enough for what's coming. A knock at the front door interrupted her reading. Through the window, she could see a well-dressed man in his 60s standing on her porch, briefcase in hand, and impatience written across his features. "Miss Blackwood, I'm Councilman Hartley from the Cedar Falls Town Council." His smile was politician perfect and equally insincere. "Wanted to welcome you back to our little community and discuss some municipal matters regarding this property." Rosalind clutched the journal protectively as she invited him in, something about his manner setting off warning bells in her mind. "I'll be direct," Hartley continued, barely glancing around the deteriorating interior. "The town has been patient about the back taxes owed on this property out of respect for your late grandmother, but with ownership transferred to you, we need to settle accounts. You owe $47,000 in accumulated property taxes, fees, and penalties." The number hit her like a physical blow. 47,000, that's impossible. I have the documentation right here. He opened his briefcase with the flourish of a magician, revealing a trick. Property assessments, late fees compounding. Annually, municipal improvement charges, all perfectly legal and properly calculated. Rosalind's hands shook as she reviewed the papers. The amounts seemed inflated, the fees excessive, but she lacked the legal knowledge to challenge them effectively. "How long do I have?" 30 days from today. After that, the property goes to public auction for unpaid taxes. His eyes gleamed, with something that looked suspiciously like anticipation. "Of course, if you're interested in selling privately, I know several developers who might make you a reasonable offer." After he left, Rosalind returned to the journal with renewed urgency. If her grandmother had accumulated significant money through this mysterious trust, perhaps there was hope. The entries grew more cryptic as 1963 progressed. September 12, 1963. The Birmingham bombing changes everything. Federal attention means we must be smarter, more careful, moving the account to safety. Lawrence knows what to do if anything happens. To me, the key is with the roses, always with the roses. October 28, 1963, 43,000 now in the trust. Families keep contributing even when they have so little. Their faith humbles me. Made arrangements with the bank president's son. He understands the cause, even if his father doesn't. Documents hidden where only family will find them. The final entries were dated just weeks before her grandmother's supposed death 15 years ago, November 15th, 2008. The trust has grown beyond my wildest dreams through careful investment. Lawrence says it's worth over $8 million now. Time to ensure its future. The young ones today don't remember the struggles, don't understand what we fought for, but they will need this foundation when their own challenges come. Rosalind is strong like her great-grandmother was. She'll know what to do when the time comes. December 1st, 2008. Everything is in place. The key opens what matters most. Behind the roses, beneath the foundation, lies the truth of what we built together. If anyone questions the account, Lawrence has the original documents. The children's future depends on secrecy until the right moment. Rosalind read and reread. The final entry, her mind racing. $8 million, now potentially worth even more after 15 additional years of investment. But where was this mysterious account? Who was Lawrence? And what did behind the roses mean? She made her way to the backyard, where her grandmother's rose garden had once bloomed in magnificent profusion. Now only thorny stems and stubborn root systems remained, having survived years of neglect through sheer determination. As she walked among the remnants, she noticed something odd about the spacing near the back fence. There was a gap where the largest bush had once grown, and the ground there seemed slightly sunken. Her heart pounding with possibility and dread, Rosalind knelt as best she could and began clearing away years of accumulated leaves and debris. Beneath the organic matter, her fingers found something hard and angular, the corner of a metal box, buried shallow and marked with a small brass rose embossed on its lid. Inside the box, wrapped in more oiled cloth, were bank documents, legal papers, and a small brass key tied with a faded ribbon. The bank statements were from an institution she'd never heard of, Citizens Trust and Loan, apparently dissolved in the 1970s. But clipped to these papers was a more recent document from Piedmont Federal Bank, showing an account transfer and a current balance that made her gasp: $9,200,000. The account was held in trust under the name the Cedar Falls Community Foundation, with Cordelia Blackwood listed as the primary trustee and Rosalind Blackwood as the designated successor. As she sat in the dying light of evening, surrounded by the remnants of her grandmother's secret garden, Rosalind felt the weight of history settling around her shoulders. Her grandmother hadn't just left her a house. She'd left her a legacy of service, struggle, and hope. The money represented decades of sacrifice by families who had contributed what little they could spare to build something lasting. But it also represented a secret that powerful people had apparently worked hard to keep buried. The brass key seemed to warm in her palm as she held it, and she found herself wondering what other locks it might open, and whether she was strong enough to handle what lay behind them. The brass key had kept Rosalind awake all night, its weight seeming to grow heavier in her palm as she'd lain in her grandmother's old bed. By morning, she'd made her decision. Whatever lock this key opened, she had to find it. The journals. References to hiding places beneath the foundation suggested only one location: the cellar. Jacob arrived just after sunrise with coffee and fresh pastries from the bakery downtown. "Thought you might need some fuel for whatever you're planning," he said, noting the determined set to her jaw. "Mrs. Penfield mentioned you've been asking questions about your grandmother's activities during the 60s. What do you know about it?" Rosalind asked, settling carefully into the kitchen chair Jacob had repaired the day before. "Not much directly. I was just a kid then, but my older sister Ruby used to help your grandmother sometimes. Said they'd cook meals for travelers who needed to rest before moving on. Never understood what it meant until years later." He paused, studying her face. "You found something, didn't you?" Rosalind showed him the journal and the key. Jacob's weathered features grew thoughtful as he absorbed the implications. "If there's something hidden down in that cellar, you shouldn't be poking around alone in your condition," he said. "Those stairs are steep and the lighting's poor. Let me help." The cellar felt different in daylight filtering through the new window Jacob had installed. Less mysterious, more solidly practical. A place for storing preserves and keeping root vegetables cool during hot summers. But as they examined the walls more carefully, Rosalind began to notice inconsistencies in the brickwork. "Here," she said, running her hand along the eastern wall, "this section looks newer than the rest." Jacob produced a small flashlight and examined the mortar. "You're right. This was patched sometime after the original construction. See how the mortar color doesn't quite match?" He tapped the wall with his knuckles, producing a hollow sound that made them both freeze. "There's space behind here," Rosalind whispered. They worked methodically, testing the brass key against every lock, latch and metal fitting they could find in the cellar. It wasn't until Rosalind noticed a small keyhole, almost hidden behind a loose brick, that they made progress. The key turned smoothly, as if it had been oiled regularly despite decades of disuse. What they revealed took their breath away. Behind The false wall lay a small chamber, barely large enough for two people to stand in comfortably, but it had clearly been designed as more than just storage. Shelves lined the walls, filled with carefully preserved documents, photographs, and personal effects. A small table and chair suggested it had been used as a workspace. Most remarkably, the walls were covered with maps, charts, and what looked like a complex network diagram showing connections between cities throughout the south and north. "My God," Jacob breathed. "It's like a command center." The photographs were particularly striking, dozens of black and white images showing families, children, elderly couples. All appeared to be carefully posed portraits, the kind taken for important documents or special occasions. Names and dates were written on the backs in Cordelia's careful script, along with notations like "settled in Detroit" or "children graduated." But it was the documents that made Rosalind's hands shake with excitement and fear. Bank statements, legal agreements, and correspondence that painted a picture of an operation far more sophisticated than she'd imagined. Her grandmother hadn't just been helping individual families. She'd been part of a coordinated network that had moved hundreds of people to safety over nearly a decade. "Look at this," she said, holding up a folder marked "Trust Agreements." Inside were original documents establishing the Cedar Falls Community Foundation, signed not just by her grandmother, but by nearly 50 other people, some names she recognized as prominent Cedar Falls families, others completely unknown to her. "The Hendersons signed this," Jacob said, pointing to one signature. "They own the hardware store, and here, the Washingtons, they ran the pharmacy until the 80s. As they continued examining documents, a clearer picture emerged. The trust hadn't just been Cordelia's project. It had been a community effort involving families from both sides of the racial divide, united in their belief that education and opportunity were rights worth fighting for. The money had come from businesses, churches, and individual families who'd contributed what they could afford. "This letter is from 1967, Rosalind read aloud. "It's from someone named Lawrence Morrison at First National Bank. He's explaining how they transferred the trust assets to a new institution after the original bank was bought out by a larger chain that was, and I quote, unsympathetic to our community development goals." "Morrison," Jacob said thoughtfully. "That name's familiar. I think his grandson Marcus works at the library now. He's into local history, might know more about all this." They spent 2 more hours in the hidden chamber, carefully documenting everything they found. The scope of the operation was staggering. Beyond the financial trust, there had been scholarship programs, small business loans, and what appeared to be an early form of community organizing around voting rights and economic development. But the most intriguing discovery was a sealed envelope marked "For Rosalind, open only in crisis." Inside, her grandmother's final letter was dated just days before her supposed death. "My dearest granddaughter, if you're reading this, then the time has come for the next generation to carry forward what we began. The trust now holds over $9 million, carefully invested and protected from those who would use it for their own gain. But money alone cannot build community. That requires courage, wisdom, and the willingness to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. I've arranged for you to inherit not just the house, but the responsibility that comes with it. Lawrence's grandson has been managing the investments, waiting for you to come home. The bank documents will explain everything. Use the money wisely. Help families, fund education, support those who are working to build a better future. But be careful. There are people in Cedar Falls who know about the trust and who have their own plans for its use. They've been patient while the money grew, but they won't wait forever. Trust your instincts and trust those who prove themselves through actions, not words. The key you hold opens more than just doors. It opens possibilities. Use it well. Love, Grandmother Cordelia. As they climbed back up to the main floor, Rosalind felt the weight of her grandmother's legacy settling around her like a cloak, warm and protective, but also heavier than she'd expected. $9 million could change everything for her and her unborn child, but it also came with obligations she was only beginning to understand. "What are you thinking?" Jacob asked, noting her contemplative expression. "I'm thinking," she said, slowly, "that inheriting this house was just the beginning." Marcus Morrison turned out to be a soft-spoken man in his early 50s, with his grandfather's gentle eyes and an encyclopedic knowledge of Cedar Falls history. When Jacob brought him to the house the next evening, he carried a worn leather portfolio that had belonged to his grandfather Lawrence. "I've been waiting for this conversation for 15 years, he said simply, settling into the chair across from Rosalind's rocking chair. "Grandfather made me promise to watch over the trust until Cordelia's family came home." The portfolio contained meticulous records that Lawrence Morrison had maintained as the unofficial financial manager of the Cedar Falls Community Foundation. Investment statements, tax documents, legal correspondence, all pointing to the same remarkable conclusion. The trust that had started with desperate families contributing whatever they could spare had grown into a substantial endowment worth over $9 million. "Your grandmother was remarkable," Marcus explained, "but she wasn't working alone. There were dozens of families involved, both black and white. They risked everything to build something that would outlast the hatred and fear of their time." "I need to understand how this really worked," Rosalind said. "The journal mentions families coming through, but what were they running from?" Marcus opened an old photo album. The civil rights movement in the South wasn't just about protests and marches. It was about survival. Families who spoke up, who tried to register to vote, who sent their children to integrated schools. They faced real danger, economic retaliation, violence, sometimes worse. The photographs he showed painted a picture of quiet heroism. Families gathered around dinner, tables in Cordelia's kitchen, children playing in the backyard while their parents talked in hushed voices, groups of people loading supplies into cars late at night. The network your grandmother helped coordinate moved over 300 families to safety between 1963 and 1970, Marcus continued. Some were temporary relocations until things cooled down, others were permanent moves to cities where they could start fresh. Each family that was helped was encouraged to contribute what they could to help the next family. "But why keep it secret all these years?" Rosalind asked. "The civil rights era is history now." Marcus's expression darkened. "Because not everyone in Cedar Falls was supportive of what they were doing. There were people who profited from keeping others down, who saw the movement as a threat to their way of life. Some of those people or their descendants are still in positions of power." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of car doors slamming drew their attention to the front yard. Through the window, Rosalind could see Councilman Hartley approaching the house with two other men she didn't recognize. "Speak of the devil," Marcus muttered, quickly closing the portfolio. Hartley didn't wait for an invitation before stepping into the living room. "Miss Blackwood, I hope you've been giving serious thought to our discussion about the property taxes. Time is running short." "Actually," Rosalind said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice, "I've been learning quite a bit about the history of this house. Did you know my grandmother ran a community assistance program here in the 60s? Something flickered in Hartley's eyes. Surprise, calculation, perhaps fear. "Ancient history, Miss Blackwood. What matters now is settling your current obligations. These gentlemen represent Development Solutions, a company interested in purchasing your property for fair market value." The two men with him had the predatory look of developers who specialized in distressed properties. They began examining the house's structure with calculating eyes, making notes about square footage and lot dimensions. "The property isn't for sale," Rosalind said firmly. "Of course it is," one of the developers said with practiced charm. "Everything's for sale at the right price. We're prepared to offer $200,000 cash, enough to cover your tax debt with something left over for yourself." Marcus stood up slowly. "I think you gentlemen should leave now. Mrs. Blackwood has made her position clear." "And who might?" "You be?" Hartley's tone carried the subtle threat of a man used to having his authority respected. "Someone who remembers when community meant something in this town," Marcus replied quietly. After they left, the atmosphere in the house felt charged with tension. Jacob, who had remained silent during the confrontation, finally spoke. "They're not going to give up easily. 200,000 is a fraction of what this property is worth if they're planning development. There's something else you need to—" "No," Marcus said, his voice heavy with reluctance. "Hartley's family has been trying to get control of this land for decades. His father was one of the people who opposed what your grandmother was doing back in the 60s. He was instrumental in getting the original bank to stop supporting the trust." Over the next hour, Marcus revealed the complicated political history that had shaped Cedar Falls during the civil rights era. The town had been divided not just along racial lines, but between those who saw change as opportunity and those who viewed it as threat. Cordelia and her allies had operated in an atmosphere of constant surveillance and occasional intimidation. "The reason your grandmother faked her death," Marcus explained, "was because Hartley's father had discovered the trust and was threatening to expose it as fraudulent. He claimed the money was being used for illegal purposes, that helping families relocate was some kind of conspiracy against the community." "Faked her death?" Rosalind felt the world shift around her. "She's living in a care facility about 30 miles from here. Dementia now, unfortunately, but she's been safe there under an assumed name. I visit her every month." Marcus pulled out a recent photograph showing an elderly woman in a wheelchair, her once sharp eyes now clouded with confusion. "She made the sacrifice to protect the trust until you were ready to inherit it properly." The implications crashed over Rosalind like a wave. Her grandmother, alive, alone, separated from family to protect a secret that could change everything. The funeral she'd attended as a young woman had been an elaborate deception designed to keep the trust safe from those who would destroy it. "I need to see her," Rosalind said, struggling to process everything she'd learned. "Tomorrow," Marcus promised. "But tonight, we need to talk about what comes next. The trust is real, the money is legitimate, and it's legally yours. But Hartley and his associates aren't going to simply accept defeat. They've been waiting 15 years for this opportunity." As they made plans for the morning visit, Rosalind found herself touched by the depth of loyalty that had sustained her grandmother's network through decades of secrecy. People like Marcus and Jacob, who had kept faith with promises made long. Ego, who had protected something precious simply because it was the right thing to do. But she also understood that the battle for her inheritance and her future was just beginning. The weathered bank deposit slips Marcus had discovered in his grandfather's files told a story that made Rosalind's hands tremble as she examined them. Each slip was dated and initialed, showing regular deposits to an account that, according to official records, had never existed. Grandfather was meticulous about documentation, Marcus explained, as they sat in the Cedar Falls Public Library's local history room. Even when they had to operate in secret, he kept records of everything. Said someday people would need proof that ordinary citizens had done extraordinary things. The slips revealed a pattern of deposits spanning from 1963 to 1975. Sometimes small amounts of $20 or $30, other times larger sums of several hundred. Each was marked with cryptic initials that Marcus was helping her decode using his grandfather's private ledger. A.W. That's Alberta Washington, the pharmacy owner. She contributed every month for 12 years. Marcus pointed to another entry. J.H. James Henderson from the hardware store. The TM entries are probably from your great-aunt Thelma, though she passed away in the 80s. What struck Rosalind most was the consistency of the contributions. Even during what must have been difficult economic periods, families had continued to support the trust. The deposits told a story of sustained commitment to something larger than individual prosperity. But how did they manage to keep the account secret? She asked. Banks have regulations, oversight. Marcus smiled grimly. Different times. Small-town banking operated on relationships and handshake agreements. My grandfather had arranged with the bank president's son, a young man who believed in civil rights even when his father didn't. They created what appeared to be a standard business development account, filed all the proper paperwork, but kept the true purpose hidden. The most revealing documents were letters from families who had been helped by the trust, carefully preserved. In acid-free folders, they painted a picture of the network's impact. Dear Mrs. Cordelia, Thomas started college at Morehouse this fall thanks to the scholarship. He's studying to be a teacher. We'll never forget what you did for our family. Enclosed is $50 for the next family who needs help. The Johnson family, Atlanta. The business loan allowed us to open our restaurant in Detroit. We're sending $200. Back to the trust as promised. Our children will grow up knowing that good people helped us when we had nowhere else to turn. Samuel and Ruth Parker. Each letter was accompanied by a photograph. Families in their new homes, graduates in caps and gowns, couples standing proudly in front of their businesses. The visual documentation was overwhelming in its testament to lives changed and dreams fulfilled. But as they dug deeper into the records, a troubling pattern emerged. Starting in the mid-1970s, there were increasing references to pressure from authorities and concerns about federal investigation. Several letters mentioned families being questioned about their connections to the trust. What happened in 1975? Rosalind asked, noting that the deposit slips stopped abruptly that year. Politics changed, Marcus explained. The civil rights movement had achieved many of its legal goals, but there was backlash. Local authorities started investigating what they called radical financial networks. Your grandmother and my grandfather realized they needed to transfer the trust to safer management. He pulled out a folder marked Transition Documents. Inside were agreements transferring the trust assets to Piedmont Federal Bank under a new legal structure that provided better protection from political interference. The brilliant thing, Marcus continued, was that they structured it as a legitimate community development foundation, all perfectly legal, all properly documented, but managed by people who understood its true history and purpose. A sharp pain in Rosalind's lower back reminded her that she'd been sitting too long. At 8.5 months pregnant, even short periods of concentration left her physically drained. But as she shifted position, something else in the files caught her attention. Marcus, look at this. She held up a bank statement from 1989. The account balance here is only $47,000, but you said the trust is worth over $9 million now. That's the remarkable part, he said with obvious pride in his grandfather's financial acumen. When they transferred the assets, Lawrence convinced the new bank managers to invest the money rather than just holding it in savings. Conservative investments mostly. Government bonds, blue-chip stocks, a few real estate purchases. Compound interest over 40 years turned less than $50,000 into over $9 million. The implications made her dizzy. Her grandmother's network hadn't just preserved their community fund, they'd grown it into something that could transform lives on a much larger scale. But why keep it hidden all these years? The civil rights battles of the 60s are ancient history now. Marcus's expression grew serious because the battles never really ended, they just became more subtle. Economic development, educational opportunities, access to capital, these are still issues in communities like Cedar Falls. The trust was always meant to address systemic problems, not just individual emergencies. They were interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Beatrice Washington, Alberta's daughter-in-law, who had agreed to meet them at the library. At 78, she moved slowly but with dignity, her silver hair perfectly styled and her dark eyes sharp with intelligence. "I remember your grandmother well, child," she said, settling into a chair with the careful movements of someone managing arthritic joints. "She used to come to our pharmacy every week, not just for supplies, but to check on families who needed help." Beatrice had brought her own collection of documents, letters, photographs, and receipts that filled in gaps in the official records. Her memories brought the dry financial documents to life, with stories of midnight meetings, coded telephone conversations, and the constant fear that discovery would mean the end of everything they'd built. The scariest time was in 1968, after Dr. King was assassinated, she recalled. Federal agents were investigating civil rights organizations, looking for communist connections or illegal activities. We had to stop meeting for 3 months until things cooled down. How did you manage to keep contributing to the trust during those years? Rosalind asked. Faith and stubbornness, Beatrice replied with a smile that transformed her lined face. We knew what we were building was bigger than any one person's fear. My mother-in-law Alberta used to say, plant trees whose shade you'll never sit in. That's what we were doing, planting trees for grandchildren we'd never meet. As the afternoon wore on, Rosalind felt the weight of her inheritance growing heavier. The trust represented more than financial resources. It embodied the hopes and sacrifices of people who had risked everything to build something lasting. The responsibility was both humbling and terrifying. There's something else you need to know, Beatrice said as they prepared to leave the library. Councilman Hartley's family weren't just opposed to what we were doing. They actively worked to undermine it. His father tried to get the bank to freeze the account in 1974, claiming it was being used to fund radical activities. What happened? Your grandmother was smarter than he was. She'd already moved the money to safety and had legal documentation proving everything was legitimate. But it made her realize that powerful people would always try to control resources that could help others gain independence. The drive home was quiet, both Rosalind and Marcus absorbing the implications of what they'd learned. The trust wasn't just her inheritance. It was a weapon that could either empower community development or be used by others for their own purposes. As they pulled into her driveway, Rosalind noticed a black sedan parked across the street. Same car had been there when they'd left for the library that morning. We're being watched, Marcus said quietly. What do we do about it? We be very careful about who we trust and what we say in public. Your grandmother survived 15 years of hiding by assuming that enemies were always listening. That evening, as Rosalind sat in her grandmother's rocking chair reviewing the day's discoveries, she felt the baby move restlessly within her, as if sensing her agitation. Outside, the black sedan remained parked beneath the streetlight, its occupants invisible behind tinted windows. The bank deposit slips spread across her lap told the story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. But they also represented something that powerful interests had been trying to control for decades. Tomorrow, she would finally meet her grandmother and learn the last pieces of the puzzle. Tonight, she had to decide whether she was strong enough to carry forward a legacy that had already cost her family so much. The hand-drawn map that Marcus unfolded on Rosalind's kitchen table was a work of art, disguised as a simple sketch. Drawn in her grandmother's careful hand, it showed the southeastern United States with dozens of small marks connected by thin pencil lines, a spiderweb of safe houses, contact points, and destination cities that had operated in secret for nearly a decade. She drew this from memory in the 1990s, Marcus explained. Said she wanted to preserve the history before the people who lived it were all gone. Each mark on the map told a story. Small houses, drawn along back roads, represented safe stops where families could rest, eat, and receive help. Churches marked with tiny crosses had provided sanctuary and sometimes financial support. Larger cities were marked with multiple symbols, indicating communities where families had successfully resettled. Look at this, Rosalind said, tracing her finger along one of the penciled routes. This path goes from Birmingham to Cedar Falls, then up through Tennessee and Kentucky to Detroit. It's like an underground railroad. That's exactly what it was, said a new voice from the doorway. They turned to see an elderly African-American man leaning on a walking stick, his weathered face creased in a gentle smile. Marcus rose quickly to help him to a chair. Mrs. Blackwood, this is Reverend Samuel Price. His church in Birmingham was one of the starting points on the network. Reverend Price settled into his chair with the careful movements of someone well. Into his 80s, but his eyes were bright with intelligence and memory. I drove over as soon as Marcus called. Been wanting to meet Cordelia's granddaughter for years. You knew my grandmother during the civil rights era? Rosalind asked. Knew her? Child, your grandmother saved my family's life. His voice carried the weight of deep gratitude. 1965, after I spoke out about voting rights from the pulpit. They burned a cross on our lawn, threw bricks through our windows. But worse than that, they got me fired from my job at the steel plant and made sure no one else in Birmingham would hire me. Reverend Price opened a worn photo album he'd brought with him. The images showed a younger version of himself with his wife and 3 small children, their faces marked by exhaustion and fear. Your grandmother heard about our situation through the church network, sent word that we could come to Cedar Falls, that there would be work and a safe place to stay while we figured out our next step. The photographs documented their journey. Images of the family loading their belongings into a borrowed truck, arriving at Cordelia's house at night, the children playing in the backyard, while the adults made plans. We stayed for 6 weeks. He continued. Your grandmother fed us, helped my wife find work at the pharmacy, and most importantly, she connected us with a church in Detroit that was looking for a pastor. The trust provided the money for gas and moving expenses. What was she like then? Rosalind asked, hungry for details about the woman she'd known only as a gentle grandmother. Fierce, he replied without hesitation. Quiet about it, but absolutely fierce in her commitment to justice. She had this network of contacts throughout the South, people who would call when families needed help, people who could provide safe passage, people who could offer jobs or housing at the destination. Reverend Price showed them more photographs, dozens, of families who had passed through the network, children who had grown up to become teachers, doctors, business owners. Each image was annotated with updates. John graduated medical school 1978. Sarah's restaurant thriving in Chicago. The twins both earned scholarships to Howard University. The remarkable thing, he said, was how the network sustained itself. Every family that was helped was encouraged to contribute back when they were able. Not just money, but information about opportunities, contacts for jobs, places where other families could find safety. Marcus spread out more documents from his grandfather's files. The scope was incredible. Between 1963 and 1970, they helped relocate over 300 families. The trust provided direct assistance to dozens of others who didn't need to move, but required financial help to survive economic retaliation. But it wasn't just about moving people, Reverend Price added. Your grandmother understood that lasting change required building economic power in communities. The trust funded small business loans, scholarship programs, and what we would now call community development projects. As they talked, Rosalind began to understand the sophisticated nature of what her grandmother had built. This wasn't just charitable work, it was systematic community organizing designed to address the root causes of inequality. Why didn't anyone write about this? She asked. It sounds like it should be in history books. Because it worked precisely because it stayed hidden, Marcus replied. The moment it became public, it would have been shut down by authorities or undermined by opponents. The families who benefited understood that secrecy was the price of effectiveness, Reverend Price nodded. We all knew that talking about it could put others at risk. So we kept quiet even after we'd settled safely in new places. The network depended on trust and discretion. The conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the front door. Through the window, Rosalind could see Jacob standing on the porch, but his usual calm demeanor was replaced by obvious agitation. You need to see this, he said as soon as she opened the door, thrusting a copy of the Cedar Falls Gazette into her hands. The headline made her stomach drop. Questions raised about historic property tax assessment. The article, written with the careful neutrality of small-town journalism, raised concerns about whether the Blackwood property had been properly assessed for tax purposes over the years. "It gets worse," Jacob said. "Read the part about community development funds." Buried in the middle of the article was a paragraph suggesting that rumors of undisclosed financial assets associated with the property might affect its proper valuation for tax purposes. The implication was clear. Someone was laying groundwork to challenge not just her ownership of the house, but her right to any funds connected to it. "Hartley," Marcus said grimly. "He's trying to build a public case that you're hiding assets to avoid paying taxes." Reverend Price studied the article with the eye of someone who had faced hostile media coverage before. "This is just the beginning. Once they start this kind of campaign, it escalates quickly. You need legal help, and you need it soon." As they discussed options, Rosalind felt the baby kick strongly against her ribs, as if responding to her elevated stress. The weight of her inheritance, both its potential and its dangers, seemed to grow heavier with each revelation. "There's something else," she said quietly. "I'm supposed to meet my grandmother tomorrow. After 15 years of thinking she was dead, I'm finally going to see her again." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The woman who had built this network, who had sacrificed everything to protect it, was still alive, and her granddaughter was about to inherit not just her legacy, but all the enemies that came with it. The forged death certificate lay on the passenger seat of Marcus's car, like an accusation, as they drove toward Riverside Manor, the assisted living facility 30 miles outside Cedar Falls. The document, discovered in the deepest files of his grandfather's records, showed clear signs of manipulation, dates that didn't align, signatures that had been traced rather than written naturally, and a coroner's seal that Marcus had determined belonged to a man who had died 2 years before. The supposed date of Cordelia's death. "She planned everything," Marcus explained as they navigated the winding country roads. "The funeral, the burial of an empty casket, even the obituary in the newspaper. My grandfather helped coordinate it all." Rosalind's hands trembled as she held the certificate. The elaborate deception meant that for 15 years, while she'd mourned the loss of the woman who had been her strongest source of love and guidance, Cordelia Blackwood had been alive, alone, cut off from family, protecting a secret that had now landed squarely on her granddaughter's shoulders. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" she asked, though part of her already understood the answer. Because the danger was real. Hartley's father had convinced federal authorities to investigate the trust as a potential money laundering operation connected to radical groups. If they'd discovered Cordelia was alive and still managing the funds, she could have faced serious criminal charges. Riverside Manor sat on a landscaped hill overlooking a small lake, its red brick facade and wraparound porches designed to evoke the comfort of a family home, rather than the institutional feel of most care facilities. Marcus led her through hallways decorated with local artwork and filled with the gentle sounds of conversation and activity. "She's in the memory care unit," he explained. "The dementia started about 3 years ago. Some days she's completely lucid, others she doesn't recognize me at all. I visit monthly and handle her care expenses through a discretionary fund from the trust." Room 37 was filled with afternoon sunlight streaming through windows that looked out over the facility's garden. In a chair by the window sat a woman who was unmistakably Rosalind's grandmother, though aged and diminished from the vibrant person she remembered. Cordelia's silver hair was neatly styled, and she wore a blue dress that Rosalind recognized from their last Christmas together. "Mrs. Davidson," Marcus said gently, using the assumed name Cordelia had taken. "You have a special visitor today." The elderly woman turned slowly, and for a moment her eyes were cloudy with confusion. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, recognition flooded her features. "Rosalind?" Her voice was thin, but unmistakably the one that had read bedtime stories and sung lullabies. "My beautiful girl, You came home. The reunion was everything Rosalind had dreamed of and more heartbreaking than she could have imagined. Cordelia's lucid moments came in waves, sometimes lasting minutes, sometimes mere seconds before the fog of dementia rolled back over her mind. "I've been waiting for you," Cordelia said during one clear interval. "Marcus said you inherited the house. Have you found what I left for you?" "The trust, grandmother. I found the trust and the journal and the secret room, all of it." Cordelia's face lit up with something approaching her old spirit. "Good, good. The money, it's for the community. You understand? Not for us, for them, for the families who need what we needed when we were struggling." In halting sentences, interrupted by moments of confusion, Cordelia told her story. How Hartley's father had discovered the trust through a disgruntled bank employee, how he'd threatened to expose it as a radical conspiracy unless Cordelia turned over control to proper authorities who would ensure the money was used for appropriate community development. How the network of families they'd helped had rallied to create the elaborate deception that allowed her to disappear before she could be arrested. "The hardest part," Cordelia whispered, gripping Rosalind's hand with surprising strength, "was knowing you would grow up thinking I had abandoned you, but if they destroyed the trust, everything we built would have been lost. I never felt abandoned, grandmother. I felt loved every day of my life because of what you taught me." During the lucid intervals, Cordelia revealed details that weren't in any of the documents: secret bank accounts in other states, investment portfolios that had been carefully diversified to protect against economic downturns. Most importantly, a network of lawyers and financial advisors who had been quietly managing aspects of the trust for decades. "There's more money than Marcus knows about," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Much more. I split it into different accounts to make it harder to trace. The main trust is just the beginning." She gave Rosalind the names of 3 banks in different states, along with account numbers she recited from memory, despite her condition. Each account held substantial funds that had been accumulating interest for over a decade. 15 million total, Cordelia said with satisfaction. "Maybe 18 million by now. Enough to transform this whole region if it's used wisely." But the most shocking revelation came when Cordelia's nurse arrived to check on her. The young woman, who introduced herself as Jennifer, had been caring for Cordelia for 2 years. As she efficiently checked vital signs and adjusted medications, she mentioned that Mrs. Davidson had been asking about her granddaughter for months. "She kept saying you were coming home to claim your inheritance," Jennifer said with a smile. "Even on her worst days, she was certain you would figure out the truth." After Jennifer left, Cordelia gripped Rosalind's hand again. "There's something else you need to know about the people trying to take the trust. It's not just about money, it's about power, control over who gets help and who doesn't, who gets to build businesses, and who stays dependent on others for work." Her voice grew weaker but more urgent. "Hartley's son. He's worse than his father ever was. Smarter, more patient. He's been waiting for you to come home so he could claim the trust was obtained through fraud. Says because I faked my death, any financial arrangements I made should be invalid. But that's not legal, is it? Legal doesn't matter if you control the judges and the politicians. Promise me, Rosalind, promise me you'll fight for what we built, not for the money, but for the principle, for the idea that communities can take care of themselves if they're given the tools." As the afternoon wore on, Cordelia's lucid periods became shorter and less frequent. But in her final clear moment before exhaustion overtook her, she smiled at her granddaughter with all the love that had sustained them both through 15 years of separation. "You're stronger than you know, sweetheart. Stronger than I ever was. Build something beautiful with what we've given you." The legal trust documents that attorney Margaret Chen spread across Rosalind's kitchen table represented 40 years of careful planning and meticulous documentation. As the lead partner in Chen, Williams and Associates, the only law firm in a 50-mile radius with experience in complex estate law, she had driven down from Richmond at Marcus's urgent request. "Your grandmother was remarkably thorough," Margaret said, adjusting her reading glasses as she examined the paperwork. These documents establish clear legal precedent for the trust's legitimacy, regardless of any personal deception about her death. The funds were properly transferred, taxes were paid, and all investments were made through legitimate financial institutions. But even as Margaret spoke confidently about the law, tension filled the room. Jacob paced by the windows, occasionally peering through the curtains at the black sedan that had maintained its vigil across the street for 3 days. Marcus sat with his grandfather's files organized in neat stacks, ready to document every detail of the trust's history. And Rosalind, now in her 9th month of pregnancy, struggled to focus through the exhaustion and physical discomfort that made every decision feel monumentally difficult. The problem, Margaret continued, is that legal precedent may not matter. If they can create enough public pressure to force a settlement, small-town politics can override legal niceties when powerful people decide they want something. As if summoned by their conversation, the telephone rang. Jacob answered it, his face growing grim as he listened to the caller. "That was Beatrice," he said after hanging up. "Someone's been going door to door in the African-American neighborhoods, asking questions about families who received money from your grandmother over the years, claiming to be investigating financial fraud. They're trying to intimidate potential witnesses," Marcus said angrily. "Classic intimidation tactics make people afraid to speak up on your behalf." Margaret made notes on her legal pad. "We need to move quickly. I recommend filing a declaratory judgment action to establish your legal right to the trust assets before they can challenge it in court. But that will require full disclosure of the trust's existence and value." The implications made Rosalind's head spin. Going public with the trust would expose $15 million to scrutiny, legal challenges, and political maneuvering. But keeping it secret meant living under constant threat of exposure by people who would use the funds for their own purposes. "There's something else," Jacob said quietly. "Mrs. Penfield heard from her nephew, who works at City Hall. They're planning to call a special town council meeting tomorrow night to discuss irregularities in property tax assessments, specifically your property." "Can they do that legally?" Rosalind asked. "They can do anything they want if no one challenges them," Margaret replied. "Small-town government operates on the assumption that most people won't fight back against official actions, even when those actions are questionable." The baby kicked hard against Rosalind's ribs as if responding to her elevated stress. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, trying to find a position that eased the constant pressure on her lower back. The timing couldn't have been worse. She was due to give birth within weeks, hardly in condition for a legal and political battle. "What if we just gave them what they want?" she asked, the words coming out before she could stop herself. "Sold the house, walked away from the trust, found somewhere else to start over." The silence in the room was profound. Marcus looked like she'd slapped him. Jacob's expression mixed disappointment with understanding. Only Margaret seemed unsurprised by the suggestion. "That's certainly an option," the lawyer said carefully. "But you should understand what you'd be giving up, not just financially, but in terms of community impact. $15 million properly invested and distributed could transform economic opportunities in this region for decades." "But I'm not an activist," Rosalind said, her voice breaking with exhaustion and fear. "I'm a pregnant woman with no money, no husband, and no experience fighting powerful people. What makes anyone think I can succeed where my grandmother had to fake her death to survive?" Reverend Price, who had been quietly listening from the corner, finally spoke. "Because, child, you're not facing the same world your grandmother faced. The legal protections are stronger now. The community networks are more established, and most importantly, you're not alone." As if to prove his point, cars began pulling into the driveway and parking along Maple Street. Beatrice Washington arrived. With a casserole and a determined expression, The Henderson family from the hardware store brought tools and cleaning supplies. Dr. Patricia Lawson, the town's only African-American physician, came with medical bags and a promise to be available when the baby arrived. Within an hour, Rosalind's house was filled with people she barely knew, but who had clear connections to her grandmother's legacy. Teachers, shop owners, mechanics, retired factory workers, all carrying stories of families who had been helped by the trust, either directly or indirectly. Your grandmother didn't build this network alone, Dr. Lawson explained as she checked Rosalind's blood pressure and found it elevated but not dangerously so. It took a community then, and it's going to take a community now, but the community is here and we're not going anywhere. Margaret watched the gathering with the calculating eye of a lawyer assessing political dynamics. This changes the equation significantly. If you have community support, Hartley and his associates will have a much harder time portraying you as an outsider, trying to defraud the town. But the afternoon brought sobering news as well. Jacob returned from town with reports that Development Solutions had been meeting with other property owners along Maple Street, making offers to purchase their homes at above-market prices. The implication was clear. They were planning a comprehensive redevelopment of the entire neighborhood. It's not just about your house or your trust, he explained. They want to tear down this whole section of town and build something new. Probably condos or commercial development. Your property is the keystone. If they can force you out, the rest of the neighborhood becomes economically unsustainable for long-term residents. As evening approached, Rosalind felt the weight of history settling around her shoulders like a heavy cloak. The trust documents on her table represented more than money. They embodied the hopes and sacrifices of people who had risked everything to build something lasting. The people filling her house weren't just neighbors. They were the living legacy of her grandmother's vision. But tomorrow night's town council meeting loomed like a storm on the horizon, and she still hadn't decided whether she was strong enough to weather it. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, and Rosalind placed both hands over her belly. Whatever decision she made would affect not just her own future, but the future of the child she would soon bring into the world. The thought both terrified and steeled her resolve. By morning, she would have to choose fight or flight. The town council meeting minutes from 1974 that Marcus had discovered that morning changed everything. Hidden in a box of his grandfather's papers that had been stored in his attic for decades, they documented a closed-door session where Councilman Hartley's father had presented what he called evidence of subversive financial activities connected to the Blackwood property. "Look at this," Marcus said, pointing to a particular passage as they sat in Rosalind's kitchen before heading to the evening's confrontation. He actually proposed seizing the property under eminent domain and using the trust funds to build a new municipal building. The other council members voted it down, but the intent is clear. Rosalind studied the faded carbon copy pages, her hands steadier than they'd been in days. After a night of little sleep and much soul-searching, she had made her decision. Trust represented more than money. It was a testament to the power of community action, and she would not let it be destroyed by people who saw dollar signs where others saw hope. The Cedar Falls Community Center was packed beyond capacity when they arrived. Every chair was filled and people stood along the walls and crowded near the doorway. The air hummed with tension and anticipation as neighbors who hadn't spoken in years found themselves on the same side of a debate that would determine the future of their community. Councilman Hartley sat at the head table with two other council members, his expression confident in the way of a man who had never lost a public battle. The Development Solutions representatives occupied the front row, their expensive suits and briefcases marking them as outsiders with serious financial backing. This meeting has been called to address irregularities in property tax assessments. On Maple Street, Hartley began, his voice carrying the authority of elected office. Specifically, Questions have been raised about whether certain properties have been properly valued given potential undisclosed assets or income streams. Margaret Chen stood up from her seat in the second row. Point of order, Councilman. My client, Mrs. Blackwood, was not properly notified that she would be the specific subject of this hearing. Due process requires— This is a general discussion of assessment procedures, Hartley interrupted smoothly. No individual property owner is being singled out for investigation. But his words rang false in the packed room, and murmurs of dissent began to ripple through the crowd. Rosalind recognized many faces, people who had come to her house over the past week, people who had shared stories of how her grandmother's network had helped their families. However, Hartley continued, if any property owner wishes to address concerns about their assessment, they're welcome to do so publicly. The invitation was clearly a trap, designed to force Rosalind into either admitting to hidden assets or appearing evasive. But she had anticipated this moment, and with Margaret's coaching, she was prepared. She rose from her chair slowly, her 9-month pregnancy making the movement awkward but somehow dignified. The room fell silent as she made her way to the microphone. At the front of the room, "My name is Rosalind Blackwood," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden quiet. "I inherited my grandmother's house on Maple Street, and I've recently learned about a community trust that she helped establish during the civil rights era." Hartley's confident expression flickered with surprise. This wasn't the defensive denial he'd expected. The Cedar Falls Community Foundation was established in 1963, she continued, by families from both the black and white communities who believed that education and economic opportunity should be available to everyone. Over 40 years, their small contributions grew into a substantial fund that is now worth approximately $15 million. Gasps and murmurs filled the room. Hartley looked like he'd been hit with a bucket of cold water. This money was earned legally, invested wisely, and managed transparently by respected members of this community. It was never hidden for tax evasion purposes. It was protected from political interference by people who understood that economic development shouldn't be controlled by a small group of powerful interests. She paused, letting her words sink in. The trust documents are here tonight, along with 40 years of financial records, tax payments, and legal documentation. Anyone who questions the legitimacy of these funds is welcome to examine the evidence. Margaret stood and began distributing copies of key documents to the council members and interested community members. The room buzzed with conversation as people realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. The public revelation of a secret that had shaped their community for decades. Furthermore, Rosalind continued, I want to announce my intention to use these funds for their original purpose: community development, educational scholarships, and small business loans for families who need assistance achieving economic independence. The applause started slowly in the back of the room, led by Beatrice Washington and Reverend Price. It spread through the crowd until the entire room was standing and clapping, drowning out Hartley's attempts to regain control of the meeting. But the most important moment came when Dr. Lawson stood up and spoke directly to the council. I move that this council formally recognize the Cedar Falls Community Foundation as a legitimate community development organization and recommend that the county assessor review the Blackwood property evaluation to ensure it reflects actual market conditions rather than speculative development potential. The motion was seconded immediately by 3 different people, and even though the council had no legal obligation to act on citizen motions, the political pressure in the room made refusal impossible. As the meeting dissolved into smaller conversations and impromptu planning sessions for the Trust's community programs, Rosalind felt something she hadn't experienced since her divorce, the sense of belonging to something larger than herself. The battle wasn't over, but tonight she had won something more valuable than legal victory. She had won the support of a community ready to reclaim its own destiny. The modern bank statement from Piedmont Federal that Margaret handed to the packed community center confirmed what everyone had hoped, but few had dared to believe. The Cedar Falls Community Foundation account showed a current balance of $9,247,382, with additional affiliated accounts bringing the total available funds to just over $15 million. These funds, Margaret announced to the standing room only crowd, are legally and unquestionably the property of the foundation, with Mrs. Blackwood serving as the designated trustee. All taxes have been paid, all investments were made through legitimate financial institutions, and all documentation meets current legal standards. The transformation in the room's atmosphere was immediate and profound. Conversations that had been tentative and worried became excited planning sessions. Parents began discussing scholarship opportunities for their children. Small business owners talked about expansion plans that had seemed impossible just hours before. But Hartley wasn't finished fighting. "Even if the funds are legitimate," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd noise, "there are still questions about proper municipal oversight of community development activities. The town council has a responsibility to ensure that large-scale financial programs operate within appropriate regulatory frameworks. It was a last-ditch attempt to maintain some control over the trust's activities. But Margaret was prepared for this argument too. The foundation will be establishing a board of directors drawn from community members, she replied. All activities will be conducted in accordance with state and federal non-profit regulations, with annual financial reporting and independent auditing, complete transparency and community accountability. As the official meeting ended and people began to drift toward the exits, Rosalind felt a familiar tightening in her lower back. At first, she dismissed it as the result of sitting in an uncomfortable chair for 2 hours while 9 months pregnant. But when the sensation intensified and began to come in regular waves, she realized what was happening. "Jacob," she whispered, catching his arm as he bent to collect her papers, "I think I need to go to the hospital." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity that seemed almost surreal after the intensity of the public confrontation. Dr. Lawson took charge immediately, directing Jacob to drive carefully but quickly to the county hospital, while she rode in the back seat, coaching Rosalind through increasingly strong contractions. "Seems like this baby decided tonight was the right time to make an entrance," Dr. Lawson said with a calm smile that reassured Rosalind even as another contraction gripped her. "Good timing, actually. Nothing like new life to celebrate new beginnings." The Cedar Falls County Hospital had been alerted by Dr. Lawson's phone call, and they were ready when Jacob's truck pulled up to the emergency entrance. As Rosalind was wheeled into the maternity ward, she caught glimpses of familiar faces in the waiting room. Marcus had driven straight from the meeting. Mrs. Penfield had somehow managed to arrive before them despite her age, and Beatrice Washington sat knitting what looked suspiciously like a baby blanket. The labor progressed quickly, as if the baby was as eager as her mother to move forward into whatever came next. Between contractions, Rosalind found herself thinking about her grandmother, wishing Cordelia could be there to meet her great-granddaughter. But in a way, she was present, in the legacy she'd left, in the community that had rallied to protect it, and in the strength that had carried 3 generations of women through difficult times. At 3:47 a.m., Hope Blackwood entered the world with a lusty cry that seemed to announce her intention to make her presence known. She was perfectly healthy, with dark hair like her mother's and an alertness in her eyes that suggested she was ready to take on whatever challenges awaited her. "She's beautiful," Jacob whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he held the tiny girl for the first time. Somewhere over the past few weeks, he had become more than just a helpful neighbor. He had become family in the truest sense of the word. As dawn broke over Cedar Falls, news of Hope's birth spread through the community with the speed that only small towns can achieve. By the time visiting hours began, the hospital waiting room was filled with people bringing gifts, flowers, and most importantly, stories about what the trust would mean to their families. Margaret arrived mid-morning with legal documents that had been prepared in advance. "I thought you might want to formalize the Foundation's board of directors while everyone's together," she suggested. "Strike while the iron is hot, as they say." The impromptu board meeting was held in Rosalind's hospital room, with Hope sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms as important decisions were made about scholarship criteria, business loan procedures, and community development priorities. Marcus agreed to serve as the financial oversight coordinator, drawing on his grandfather's experience with the original trust. Beatrice accepted the position of community outreach director, leveraging her decades of connections throughout the region. Reverend Price would chair the scholarship committee, ensuring that educational opportunities reached the families who needed them most. Most surprisingly, Dr. Lawson announced her intention to establish a community health clinic using part of the trust funds, addressing medical care access issues that had plagued the region for years. "Your grandmother always said the money should work where it was needed most," she told Rosalind. "Healthcare, education, economic development, all pieces of the same puzzle." As the day wore on and visitors came and went, Rosalind began to understand that Hope's birth had marked more than just a personal milestone. It represented the beginning of a new chapter for an entire community. The trust that had operated in shadows for decades would now work openly to address the same issues that had motivated its creation: inequality, limited opportunity, and the belief that communities could solve their own problems when given the resources to do so. That evening, as the hospital grew quiet and Hope nursed contentedly, Jacob sat in the chair beside the bed, reading aloud from a letter that had arrived by special delivery. "Dear Mrs. Blackwood," he read, "congratulations on the birth of your daughter and on the successful establishment of the Cedar Falls Community Foundation. Your grandmother would be very proud of what you've accomplished. I look forward to working with your board of directors to ensure the Trust's continued growth and community impact. Sincerely, William Morrison, Trust Account Manager, Piedmont Federal Bank." The letter included updated account statements, showing that publicity from the town meeting had actually triggered additional donations from families who had been helped by the original network decades earlier. The foundation's resources had grown to over $16 million in just 24 hours. "What are you thinking about?" Jacob asked, noting Rosalind's contemplative expression. "I'm thinking," she said, adjusting Hope's position and marveling at the tiny fingers that gripped her thumb with surprising strength, "that sometimes the best things in life come disguised as the hardest challenges. A year ago, I thought my life was over. Tonight, I feel like everything is just beginning." The restored family Bible that Jacob found during the mansion's renovation 6 months later contained birth records dating back to 1847, completing a family history that had been scattered across decades of displacement and secrecy. Hidden behind a loose board in what had once been the servants' quarters, the leather-bound volume held not just genealogical information, but pressed flowers, family photographs, and handwritten notes that painted a picture of generations of strong women who had faced adversity with grace and determination. Rosalind sat in her grandmother's rocking chair, now refinished and placed in the sunny front parlour of the restored Victorian mansion, nursing 6-month-old Hope while reviewing the morning's foundation business. The house that had once been a symbol of decay and abandonment now served as the headquarters for the Cedar Falls Community Foundation, its rooms transformed into offices, meeting spaces, and a small library dedicated to preserving local civil rights history. "The scholarship applications are impressive this year," Marcus reported, settling into the chair across from her with a stack of files. 43 high school seniors applying for college funding and 12 adults seeking support for vocational training programs. Through the bay window, Rosalind could see children playing in the front yard while their parents attended a small business development workshop in the dining room. The community garden that had been planted where her grandmother's secret rose garden once bloomed was thriving in the late summer heat, tended by families who received fresh produce in exchange for their labor. Dr. Lawson's community health clinic occupied the mansion's former library, providing basic medical care and health education to families who had previously relied on expensive emergency room visits for routine healthcare needs. The morning's patients had included elderly residents checking blood pressure, young mothers bringing babies for well-child visits, and teenagers receiving education about nutrition and exercise. "Any word from grandmother today?" Rosalind asked. Knowing that Marcus had visited Riverside Manor the day before, she had a good day yesterday, recognized me immediately, and asked about Hope. His smile was tinged with sadness. "She's failing physically, but her mind is clearer lately. The nurses think the stress of keeping secrets for so many years was affecting her condition. Now that everything's out in the open, she seems more peaceful." The transformation in Cedar Falls over the past 6 months had exceeded everyone's expectations. The Foundation's business loan program had funded the expansion of the Henderson family's hardware store, the establishment of a new restaurant by the Washington family's youngest son, and the startup of a home renovation business run by 3 recent high school graduates. Property values on Maple Street had stabilized and begun to rise as young families moved into renovated homes rather than fleeing to newer suburbs. Most remarkably, the Foundation's success had attracted attention from other communities facing similar challenges. Delegations from small towns throughout the South had visited Cedar Falls to study the model and adapt it to their own circumstances. "The reporter from the Richmond paper will be here this afternoon," Jacob reminded her as he entered the parlor carrying a cup of coffee and the morning mail. Over the months since Hope's birth, his presence in their lives had evolved from helpful neighbor to something much deeper. The relationship had developed slowly, built on shared commitment to the community and genuine affection that had surprised them both. The mail included a letter from the governor's office commending the Foundation's work and inviting Rosalind to serve on a state commission studying community development strategies. There were also thank you notes from scholarship recipients, updates from families who had received business loans, and a particularly touching letter from a young woman whose college education had been funded by the original trust in the 1960s. And who was now ready to contribute to the next generation's opportunities. But the most meaningful correspondence was a handwritten note from Cordelia, delivered by Marcus from his previous day's visit. "My dearest Rosalind and precious Hope, I'm so proud of what you've built with the Foundation. The house looks beautiful in the photographs Marcus shared, alive again, with purpose and community. I know my time is limited, but I am at peace, knowing that the work we began will continue. Through your hands and Hope's generation, the secret room in the cellar should become a museum, so people can understand that ordinary citizens can do extraordinary things when they work together. All my love, Grandmother Cordelia." As afternoon approached, Rosalind prepared for the day's final Foundation meeting, a planning session for the annual community celebration that would mark the first anniversary of the Trust's public revelation. The event would honor the original families who had contributed to the network, recognize the year's scholarship and loan recipients, and announce new programs for the coming year. Hope gurgled contentedly in her carrier as Rosalind made her way to the dining room, where board members were gathering around the long table that had once hosted secret meetings during the civil rights era. The room buzzed with conversation about upcoming projects, a partnership with the regional community college to offer classes in Cedar Falls, a housing rehabilitation program for elderly residents, and an ambitious plan to establish a small manufacturing cooperative that would create jobs while keeping young people from leaving for larger cities. As the sun set over Cedar Falls, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber, Rosalind found herself back in the rocking chair with hope drowsing in her arms. The mansions settled around them with the comfortable sounds of a home well lived in. Jacob's voice drifting from the kitchen where he was cleaning up after the evening meeting, the gentle hum of the central air conditioning that had been installed during the restoration, and the distant laughter of neighborhood children playing in the long summer twilight. The baby stirred in her sleep, tiny fists unclenching as she settled more deeply into dreams. Looking down at her daughter's peaceful face, Rosalind felt a profound sense of completion. The broken pieces of her life, the failed marriage, the financial struggles, the loneliness of single motherhood, had somehow arranged themselves into something beautiful and meaningful. Her grandmother had been right about strength sometimes looking like showing up alone and staying. But she had also learned that true strength came from understanding that you were never really alone, that communities of care and commitment existed across generations, waiting for someone brave enough to claim their inheritance and build something lasting with it. As Hope's breathing deepened into true sleep, Rosalind began to rock gently, humming the old hymn she remembered her grandmother singing all those years ago. Outside, the restored mansion stood as a testament to the power of persistence, community, and the unshakable belief that tomorrow could always be better than yesterday.